Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good day, I'm Bob Rush. Welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. We're very fortunate today to have with us two outstanding individuals with different perspectives on the law. What we're going to be addressing today is the amendment, constitutional proposed amendment that will be on your ballot when you vote. It has to do with guns. We'll find out during our discussion what this proposed amendment regarding the right to bear arms has on you as an Iowa citizen, and how it impacts on law enforcement, how it impacts on the court system. We have with us Brian Gardner, the sheriff of Linn County. We have with us Mark Kende, the director of the Drake Constitutional Law Center. And I'm sorry that we don't have, we were expecting to have the president of the Iowa Firearms Coalition, a proponent of the amendment. So, gentlemen, let's start with Mark. Mark, we've got this language on this proposed amendment. Could you educate us a bit on what is it and what issues do you see surrounding it?
I think the main controversy is some language that basically says if you want to restrict or regulate guns, the laws involved in trying to do that would have to meet strict scrutiny. And strict scrutiny is the highest burden for any law to meet. So this amendment is very protective of people who want to have pretty much an absolute right to do what they want up to a point with guns, and makes it hard for people who want to have some regulations with regard to guns, such as who might have access to them, etc. And that's all because of this language in there, which says those restrictions, regulations, they have to be subjected to strict scrutiny. And that's tough for a regulation to satisfy.
Well, don't we already have a federally guaranteed right to bear arms? Does this proposal impact in any way upon our federally guaranteed right to bear arms?
It actually makes it even more liberal, if you want to use that word in this context, in terms of the gun owner having probably more rights. There was a Supreme Court opinion called Heller, in which a very conservative Justice Scalia endorsed an individual's right to bear arms. But then he put in there that it's okay probably for the government to regulate in certain ways who can bear arms. For example, maybe some people who've committed felonies or who are mentally challenged might be people who should not be able to bear arms. Justice Scalia said, well, Iowa's new law might make it hard for those kinds of limitations on access to weapons. It might make those limitations difficult to survive a court challenge.
Sheriff, you've been in law enforcement for how many years?
This is my 42nd year, Bob.
And you've been sheriff for how long?
This is my 4th term.
Okay. Do you see any problems with this proposed amendment?
I do. Linn County Attorney Nick Maybanks and I have been fairly vocal about our opposition to this proposed amendment to the Iowa Constitution. Don't get me wrong, neither of us are anti-gun. Neither of us are anti-Second Amendment. Neither of us are looking to take away the public's right to own and possess firearms. But the strict scrutiny language takes the Second Amendment to a whole nother level. What it does is it really has the potential to negate the current gun laws on the books in the state of Iowa, and really curtails any future gun laws for being enacted in the state of Iowa. So rather than a public safety measure, which the Second Amendment could very easily have been viewed as, public measure number 1, because of the strict scrutiny language, ends up being really a challenge for public safety, a concern for public safety. And I truly believe it does not make the public any safer if this constitutional amendment were to be approved by the voters and applied to our Constitution.
Mark, one of the things that Justice Scalia mentioned in the Heller case that we've talked about was constitutional language. He looks to the simple, normal use of language to help guide him. Is this proposed amendment is not the same as the U.S. Second Amendment, is it?
It is much more protective of the rights of gun owners to the extent that what some people call common sense restrictions on gun ownership, and I know other people disagree with that terminology, but I'll just use it for the sake of discussion. It would have the effect of making those kinds of supposedly common sense approaches to restricting gun ownership disappear. It would make them not necessarily survive. So yes, there's a very big impact that this would have.
Sheriff, there are not that many gun restrictions currently in effect, are there?
No, actually, since about 2010, the gun laws have loosened significantly in the state of Iowa. 2010 was the enaction of the shall issue law, which prohibited sheriffs from randomly refusing to issue carry permits to gun owners. It used to be that sheriffs had all the power in the world. There were literally 99 different standards for Iowa's 99 different counties. In fact, when I ran for sheriff back in 2008, I actually campaigned on the shall issue format, thinking that me as a sheriff, I don't know all 250,000 residents of the state. Granted, not all of them are gun owners, but it's hard for me to determine, barring any prohibitor, that a person should not be entitled to carry a gun. So that's what we started when I became sheriff in 2009. We went by the shall issue philosophy. Although at the time I still had some leniency, I still had the ability to even put some conditions on a permit. I required that permits needed to be, weapons needed to be concealed when carried, and that you could not carry while intoxicated or under the influence of drugs. That all went away in 2010. No longer could sheriffs across the state condition their permits. They were all one standard. The concealed carry conditions that many sheriffs had used went away. Open carry is the law of the land. And then here more recently, what's commonly referred to as constitutional carry came into play. And what that means is if you're legally able to possess a handgun, you don't need a permit to do so. Now, many people still do. I encourage people to still get a permit. You need it for the reciprocity to travel to other states. Plus, it's easier for you to purchase a firearm if you want to purchase a handgun over the counter and not have to wait for the NICS check, the national check. You can get a permit to purchase or a permit to carry, and you can go in and purchase a handgun at that time. So yes, Iowa's laws have lessened significantly since 2010, since about the time I took office, and the sheriffs across the state mostly accepted that. But this new proposal with the strict scrutiny language does not make the public safer. In fact, I think it puts the public at risk. And I personally am not in favor of this proposed amendment.
Okay. Mark, are there any states that have this kind of language?
There are, I think, 3 states at least that have this kind of language, which suggests it's pretty unusual. And it puts Iowa in a category which I think the supporters of this amendment want to be in, which is they want to show Iowa as one of the most easy to have access and use guns of all the states in the nation. So there are a few, but there are some good reasons most states have not done that. And some of those good reasons we can talk about even more, including what the sheriff has already alluded to, that this is not necessarily going to make us safer.
That my research says Alabama, Louisiana, and Missouri have this strict scrutiny language on the books. What I thought was noteworthy was those states rank among the top 5 of gun deaths per capita.
Right. And I think the sheriff did a nice job in the editorial or op-ed that was published recently in mentioning Iowa right now is very low in terms of gun deaths. And of course, we all want to stay low in terms of gun deaths. So that's an important issue to keep in mind.
Sheriff, do you think we'll be a safer state if this law should, or this amendment pass and go into our Constitution?
Sure, thanks. No, I don't believe so. I think that it does do away with common sense gun laws that we have currently on the books. It would certainly prohibit us from enacting any additional laws which may be viewed as common sense gun laws. You know, Iowa currently ranks 42nd in the nation for per capita gun deaths. 44 other states have actually adopted the U.S. Second Amendment as part of their Constitution. And as you already mentioned, only 3 states in the nation have included that strict scrutiny language. So we'd be one of 4 nationwide. And as you currently measured, the other 2 states rank 2nd, 4th, and 5th for per capita deaths by guns. I don't think that's a top 5 that the state of Iowa wants to get into. I don't think that Iowa citizens want to get in that top 5. And I think there's a lot of confusion as to what strict scrutiny means. Like I say, Linn County Attorney Nick Maybanks and I have kind of gone around explaining our concerns with this law. And some people have come up to us and erroneously assume that strict scrutiny means that gun laws will be more strict and there will be more scrutiny with those gun laws, when in fact it's exactly the opposite.
The Des Moines Register published a poll very recently about this particular amendment, showing majority of people apparently in favor of passing it. And one of the persons interviewed by the newspaper was from Linn County, and she said, if more people were allowed to bear arms here in Iowa, if it was more legal, more people wouldn't be getting in trouble for it, she said, and she plans to vote for it. So is there anything, let's start, Mark, with you, and then Sheriff for your response. But Mark, is there anything in this proposed amendment, should it fail, that would affect my right, my Second Amendment rights under the U.S. Constitution to obtain and possess a firearm?
Absolutely not. And as was mentioned earlier, I was pretty liberal in allowing people to have lots of access to firearms. And if this amendment failed, you'd still have the full protections of the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which has been interpreted in a fairly significant way to allow people to have that right. That right would not be lost at all. And I think that's part of what's really important to understand here. This is not a case of voting, as the sheriff mentioned, for guns or against guns. People are going to have guns in Iowa. They have a right to own them. But what this seems to do is take away the possibility of, again, what has been described as some common sense limitations. And even those limitations are not necessarily going that far in many respects. So I think there's a little bit of an exaggeration as to this having a very bad effect on gun owners.
Sheriff, anything to add on that point?
Bob, I think what we're looking at is if this constitutional amendment does become part of the Iowa Constitution, I think you're looking at common sense gun laws currently on the books that may end up being adjudicated to be unconstitutional at that point in time. I think that currently in the state of Iowa, there's a law that prohibits felons from possessing weapons. I think that could be challenged, and I know it has in those other 3 states that have enacted such a constitutional amendment. I think you could see that felons now would be more easily able to acquire and carry handguns. As a matter of fact. Also, I know we currently do not allow domestic abusers to possess weapons, people who are subject to no contact orders. I think that those folks have been successfully challenged laws in other states. There's other 3 states, and the judges have ruled in their favor because of the strict scrutiny language. I think you will see, again, some common sense laws that are currently on Iowa's books that will go to the wayside. As far as perhaps proposed legislation that may be enacted, but would not be allowable under strict scrutiny. There's universal background checks, so that's always getting tossed around. That is literally 85% supported by the population of the nation. And you could find that's no longer allowable in the state of Iowa. Extreme protection orders, sometimes called red flag orders. I know we do not have those in Iowa. There has been some talk about enacting them. And what they allow is for a family member to come forward in front of a judge and to get a judge to put a temporary restriction on that person possessing firearms until such time as a hearing. Because the family feels that person is such a danger at the time to possess weapons. That would literally prohibit the strict scrutiny provision would literally prohibit that law from being enacted in the state of Iowa.
Mark, I think the Iowa Constitution has some 20 items described as the Iowa Constitutional Bill of Rights. Do any of those rights in the Iowa Constitution, are they subject to this language of strict scrutiny?
I think, for example, freedom of speech and free exercise of religion in certain instances, restrictions on ability to speak and worship as you wish would be potentially subjected to a high level of scrutiny. But, those are in the Constitution. They're in the Bill of Rights. They're in the U.S. Constitution as well. They're generally accepted, and they don't have anything to do with public safety for the most part. So it's much less problematic. But here you're taking away the right to do some things that would protect public safety, and you are also potentially raising some separation of powers issues that we could talk about.
That is a good segue into my question. The Iowa Constitution does not dictate to the courts what standards they should use in reviewing a particular law. Is that correct?
Right. The usual process is the legislature and the governor pass a law, and if the law violates someone's rights or someone feels like it's violating their rights, that person can bring a challenge, and that challenge goes to court, and it's a court that decides what the level of scrutiny is. This is the way it is done at the federal level. This is the way it is done in almost every state, not everyone, but the idea is that it's the court's job. It's their function to decide whether a right is fundamental and whether strict scrutiny, what level of scrutiny should be used. And so the legislature is kind of, in a way, interfering with a very core function of the judiciary by prescribing a particular level of scrutiny. And that's somewhat problematic. I think we generally want to keep our various branches of government separate.
Is there anything in the federal Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, that dictates to the courts how those federal constitutional rights should be determined or reviewed?
Nothing at all like that in the U.S. Constitution. It's the U.S. Supreme Court that decides the level of scrutiny or how a law should be reviewed. And just like that, in Iowa, it has traditionally been for the Iowa Supreme Court to decide what the level of scrutiny is, not for the legislature to, through an amendment process, dictate this level of scrutiny. So there really is a concern about a little bit of an intrusion into separation of powers.
Speak a little bit more, please, about we have three separate co-equal branches of government under our state constitution. Help our audience understand what that means.
Sure. So the legislature is in charge of basically writing and passing the laws. The governor's in charge of deciding whether to approve them or not, and then to sort of implement them. The governor heads the executive branch, so her job is to carry out the law. And traditionally, it has always been the job of the court to interpret the law and interpret the Constitution. A constitutional amendment like this if questions came up about what it means, you would ask the Iowa Supreme Court, or, possibly some other judicial type of institution, but definitely the Iowa Supreme Court would be the first place you assume would be the place to discuss and decide how this works out. And they each have their three separate functions, and things are better when there isn't a situation where one side or one body like the legislature has too much power.
I think it was the first Iowa Constitution, which didn't stay on the books too long. It was replaced, gave the legislature the power to select judges. That was quickly disposed of, I think, at the next Constitutional Convention. This would seem to turn things back in the direction of the early 19th century.
Yeah, it's an approach that, I think should be distressing regardless of your position on firearms, in that normally, as I said, the court should be the one to decide the level of scrutiny. The court is made up of lawyers with that expertise. I'm not saying the court's perfect, and I'm not saying the legislature doesn't do a good job, but it's a very unusual arrangement to set it up this way, and rather unprecedented, and not certainly consistent with the U.S. Supreme Court and its practice.
And Sheriff, you've said it, but just to make sure our audience appreciates it, this proposed language is not the same language as we see in the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution.
Correct. Bob, if that were the case, we probably wouldn't be having this discussion. I wouldn't be opposing it, certainly. In fact, I'm just the opposite. I would be encouraging people to vote for taking the language as currently exists in the U.S. Constitution for the Second Amendment and bringing it into the state of Iowa's Constitution. That's really a no-brainer. We already required to follow it because of the U.S. Constitution. Incorporating it, as 44 other states have, into our Constitution verbatim is not a bad idea. But what needs to be pointed out here is this inclusion of the word strict scrutiny. It wasn't an oversight. It wasn't a mistake by the legislature. The legislators intentionally included strict scrutiny language in there as a measure to ensure the absolute minimum of gun laws now and moving into the future. Not just for us, but our children, our grandchildren, everyone moving into the future. That's the new law of the land. So, if it had been just including the Second Amendment, I'd be raising that banner and telling people to vote for it. But I can't in good conscience ask people to vote for this proposed amendment with the inclusion of the strict scrutiny language, knowing that it has the great potential, if not the probability, to make us less safe and put the public at risk.
I've reviewed the Iowa Firearms Coalition website, and Mark, they explain that one of the reasons they fought for this kind of deviation from the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution is that they didn't want to risk some judge going off the map on interpreting laws. Is that, would you respond to that argument?
Sure. I mean, that is the judge's map. The judge's map is to interpret the laws. So, first of all, that is the area where judges have the expertise and are expected to make the decisions. As to a particular judge doing something that, the Firearms Coalition doesn't like, it's always possible in any circumstance that a judge could do something that's not correct. But that's why we have an appeal process, and we have other courts that can get involved. So the fact that it falls within the judge's normal sort of jurisdictional map is a perfectly good thing. And if a judge does something extreme, there's an appellate process, and there's a Supreme Court here to take care of that.
Okay. Gentlemen, we have just a few minutes left. The issue seems to be confusing to folks that have interviewed in the poll that say they are in favor of it. Is there any rationale or any perspective on why there is that lack of understanding among some members of the public? Sheriff, any thoughts on that?
Well, like I say, Linn County Attorney Nick Maybanks and I have been very vocal about our opposition to this proposed amendment to the Iowa Constitution. I think it works well for the proponents of this amendment not to overly publicize it. If you read it at face value, it appears to be merely bringing the Second Amendment into the Iowa Constitution. And some people are misunderstanding that strict scrutiny language to mean that gun laws may be more strict, they may be more scrutinized, and they may make Iowans safer, when in fact that is exactly the opposite of what this proposed amendment really proposes to do. Iowans will not be safer. It negates some of the gun laws we have on the books now that are good common sense gun laws. In actuality, practical application, it probably does not allow us to include any common sense gun laws into the future. I think people really need to understand what it is that they're voting for. Of course, it's on the back of the ballot type of an issue to begin with. Doesn't draw a lot of attention. I think only by people such as me and Linn County Attorney Nick Maybanks explaining to the public exactly what this is, may they be more informed before they actually vote.
Thank you. Mark, you teach constitutional law, strict scrutiny. Is that something you cover in just a few minutes in a class?
Yes, we cover strict scrutiny, and it actually is something that's involved with a variety of different issues. So, but one thing I want to mention is, the framers of our U.S. Constitution were very brilliant individuals, and, they were involved in writing, the Second Amendment. Iowa would do very well if it adopted language like the Second Amendment. It would protect individual rights, but it might also allow for reasonable possible limitations in certain circumstances. You can't do wrong if you're following the framers on an issue like this in many situations.
And I would add that the Iowa framers were given an opportunity to include the right to bear arms in the Iowa Constitution more than 100 years ago, and they elected not to include it at that time. So just a minute or so left. Gentlemen, Sheriff, anything you would like to add to the conversation?
Sure. Quickly, thank you, Bob. I'm not anti-gun. I'm not anti-Second Amendment. I'm not looking to take your guns. But I am here to try to point out that this proposed amendment to the Iowa Constitution does not make you safer. It endangers current common sense gun laws that are on the books, and literally will prohibit any additional common sense gun laws from being added into Iowa law. I wholeheartedly ask people to vote no for this proposed amendment.
Thank you. Mark, any closing comment?
Well, there's some evidence that suggests empirically that, some of the changes made with regard to gun laws that have made it easier to own them for almost anyone seem to be coinciding with an increase in gun crimes. And while, that's a complicated issue, I think it's important to just keep in mind that this may not make us safer. As the sheriff has said so eloquently, it may make us in a more risky situation.
Sheriff Brian Gardner, thank you very much. Professor Mark Kende, thank you very much for enlightening us and sharing with us your ideas.
Sure.
Thank you.